Hello, welcome to Love and Flowers and You with Dr. Jennifer Love in Los Angeles, Dr. Michelle Flowers in Chicago, and I'm international journalist Marina Hutchinson in Atlanta. Michelle, you wanted to talk about courage and fear today. Why?
So this is our first listener question. The name of our podcast is Love and Flowers and You. And the idea behind that was that Jennifer and I really wanted to be able to field questions and share our experience walking with so many people on their human experiences with everyone. And so our first question comes from somebody who's been pilot listening to the podcast, and she asked us to speak about anxiety and what if you shouldn't have any. What's the right amount of anxiety? Is there a way to get rid of it? Are you just supposed to live with it? And the quote that popped into my head was something that I read when I was going through my divorce. And the quote is from Nelson Mandela. And he says that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it, which is interesting because I had been already playing with that concept. Raising my first daughter was very anxious as a young child. And there was a turning point in her life when we were at a fair, like a village carnival kind of thing. And they had a high ropes course. And I could tell that she really wanted to do it, but she was terrified. She was about 6 or 7 at the time. And I said to her, you know what, if you are scared and you let that be the decision maker, you're never going to get what you want. But I promise you that if you're brave, you're going to have more fun. And she did it. And even now she's almost 16, and she will talk about that period of time being one where she faced her fear and triumphed over it. And because of that, she got this courage that stays with her now forever.
It's true. Sometimes whenever you have something that you don't look forward to, maybe it's a job interview, a date, whatever it is, but you just kind of have to take that leap of faith and do it. And then you feel so much stronger after you've done it because you realize, hey, I was able to do it despite the fear. But you just kind of have to push yourself. So Jennifer, your thoughts on courage and fear?
You know, I was thinking about when Michelle sent me this quote and fear and how new of a concept it is for me in my life. Looking at the years of my life, because I was raised in a very kind of religious environment where we were taught, do not fear. And, you know, it's all throughout the Bible and you shouldn't fear. And so I was just kind of taught that fear is something that's bad that comes if you aren't trusting in God, that there's this moral failing. And it wasn't really until, this is kind of sad to admit, but it wasn't until I actually was in med school and had my first class in psychiatry and I learned about anxiety disorders and I was like, oh, this is actually a thing. You know, so this whole time all these feelings you just shove and shove and shove and just go, oh, I can't have this. But fear actually is a real thing. And there was no discussion in my childhood of what is healthy fear versus unhealthy fear. And fear serves a purpose. It's a very real thing in our lives. And I don't think it serves us to completely dismiss it. We don't want to be overwhelmed by it. But we need to recognize it. And once we recognize it, then we can that's when courage can step in. But it was kind of interesting for me to stop and think about, for me, what the origin of fear is in my life, because it was, don't have any. And I did. So it didn't work very well for me.
I think this episode particularly is going to be focused on what are the useful aspects of fear. So Marina was describing this situation where maybe you're going for a new job or you want to try something new and you feel this anxiety. And for me, with a lot of people, that's how you know you're in the right spot, right? If nothing ever generates any anxiety in you or worry or nervousness or excitement, then you're probably not evolving to the level that you're able to evolve.
Well, we have these kind of safety zones. We create these zones of safety, and fear is when you step outside of your zone of safety.
Yeah.
So it can be, you know, you're hiking and you run into a bear. That's a real fear. And then there's all these fears that we imagine. And there are fears when we decide we want to leave the bubble and do something new. And sometimes in life, we're dragged out of this bubble. You know, we lose a job, or our spouse loses a job, or there's a big illness, or there's something that looms and pulls us out of that comfort zone. And we are thrust into fear, you know, oftentimes without warning. And so that's where I think the choices, that's where we have choice. And that's where courage comes into play. And what do I do with this fear, and how do I move with it, and how do I not feel frozen with it? What do you think, Michelle, your friend had in mind when she was asking us to address this? What do you think she really was asking?
So first I was showing you, this is my word of the year, choice, which we talked about. And I keep it on this necklace on me, and it's a reminder, but it's a choice of how to deal with fear or anxiety or whatever emotion is coming up. I think that anxiety is a huge topic. And for this particular episode, we're talking about what are the useful aspects of anxiety. For example, you're on a hike and you see a bear. That anxiety that you feel is important as well, because it makes you faster. It increases blood flow to your brain, which will hopefully make you smarter in that situation. And instead of just saying, oh, that's really cute teddy bear, I think I want to go see if I can touch it, you'll be smarter. And because of your fear, you won't do that. It's never a good thing to try to put yourself in a situation where you have no fear whatsoever, right?
Yeah, well, you know, that's the ideal, right? I would love to live a life where, you know, there are no bears. And that isn't just reality. That just isn't reality living, at least in America today, but I think globally. There are fears everywhere. We in America have fears with guns everywhere. In certain neighborhoods, people have a very real fear. So fear is going to be there. We can do as much as we can to try to avoid it, but it's always going to be there. One of the big things we have to think about is, how are we actually going to deal with this fear? Are we going to try to solve the fear, or are we rushing to just alleviate the fear? And that's where I think a lot of us get caught up, and people run back and forth in trying to alleviate. I had a patient who came to me just in complete distress, was just miserable in his marriage, and his wife was cheating, was lying about it. He had caught her, was still just lying to his face. He felt so disrespected, so heartbroken, so dishonored in that relationship. And when he left, and they had gone to marital therapy, and like they were just trying everything, but she was just lying. And like, what do you do when your partner's lying constantly? And he had the evidence. And, you know, he would leave, and then he had this really adverse event in childhood. And so when he left, his abandonment was triggered. And that fear of abandonment that was so rooted in his early childhood experiences was so powerful that his brain just went to, well, what is the fastest way to get rid of this horrible feeling? So he would go back. And then initially he would feel relieved because he didn't feel that abandonment anymore. And then after a few weeks, he'd be like, wait a minute, this is unhealthy for me. She's lying to me every day. Like, this isn't a good partnership. Like, she hasn't changed. The therapy's not helping. Then he'd go to leave again and get that trigger. And he was running to the path of the least pain, trying to alleviate. And it took, for us, it took some therapy. Once we recognized the pattern, then, okay, well, how do you actually solve it then? So people get caught in alleviating. And so this is the pitfall of fear. People drink too much, or they start smoking too much pot, or, you know, they just dissolve into a world of video games rather than having to address the fear.
And what was the solution for him? What was the final solution for him?
Well, for him, he had to kind of face those demons of his childhood and that abandonment trigger. When things happen to us when we're kids, we don't process them the same way we do when we're adults. So kids have emotions that are very powerful, but they don't have adult processing. So if you and I had a traumatic event today, we would process it very differently than if we were 6 or 7 years old. And so he actually had to go back and do some therapy to get back to that initial traumatic event, to kind of desensitize him to that. So as an adult, he could learn to process that, because what's happening when he's re-experiencing this abandonment, his adult brain goes offline. It was just shutting down. And so he was having these emotions of this child. And so he couldn't logic his way through the situation. So for him, it was ultimately working with a fabulous therapist who could kind of walk him back and get to the root of it, so he could kind of move forward and make the decisions he needed to make, whether that was to divorce or to stay and try to work things out. But it wasn't going to be, his actions weren't going to be dictated by this trigger anymore.
And I want to bring in the Dale Carnegie quote on fear. He says, if you want to conquer fear, don't sit home and think about it, go out and get busy. So it sounds like this patient had to go out and get busy. And I think that's what you have to do in a lot of cases. And some people, for example, are trying to think, what to do with the next relationship or with their next career choice. And yet I think a lot of people sometimes stay stuck in a rut because they're afraid of making that change. Michelle, you were shaking your head on it.
Right, thinking that, okay, the fear means I can't do it, when the fear actually is your signal that this is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. I had last week a young adult patient call me after having a wild night out on the town and missed a meeting in the morning and woke up in huge anxiety. And the solution for him was get to work as soon as possible and do something that's meaningful, right? Because you're going to sit home and imagine all these horrible scenarios, and none of that is going to get you anywhere past this fear.
And I can certainly think of times when I've been afraid of doing something. And then I know recently, Michelle, you had given me advice on when I wanted to go to France, and I thought, I'm afraid, and you talked me into it. And then I did it, I had a great time. And you really learn from it. So you really have to push yourself. Can you guys think of times when you were afraid and didn't want to do something, and then, kind of dug up the courage? Probably this is an example for you.
Well, this is a huge example. I mean, we talked about this in our pilot episode of why we're doing this. And I talked about how introverted I am and everything. But we have an episode on, the word of the year and talking about what we're doing for this year. But my word of the year last year was courage. And what was so interesting to me going through that was at the very end of the year, when I'm wrapping up the year and everyone says, hey, wait a minute, it's almost New Year's. What's your new word going to be? My first thought was, well, I have to do courage again because I don't feel any different. And it wasn't until I stopped and reflected and saw all the decisions I had made, all the things that I had done that were so bold and courageous. And I realized that for me, courage isn't a feeling. Fear is an emotion. It is a powerful emotion. It is like electrifying running through your body because we're wired for fight or flight. Courage isn't like that. Courage is action despite that. It isn't a feeling. It isn't bravery. It isn't feeling confident. Courage and confidence have nothing to do with each other. So that was, I think, one of the biggest learning points for me last year, that when I have a fear, I don't have to be confident. I just have to be courageous in stepping out of it.
I was thinking a lot of women I've heard seem to have fears, and it sounds even your patient, Michelle, Jennifer, had that fear of being left by his wife. And a lot of women fear that their husbands will leave them maybe if they take a job or do something, and they maybe sometimes don't take actions because they're afraid that taking this action will hurt their relationship. Michelle, your ideas on that?
I think it's important to think about if you're keeping yourself small because of fear. And one, is that fear even rational? Or are you using it as an excuse? Right? Things are not going to go well in my marriage if I take this job. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But have you stopped to evaluate whether you're making an excuse or this is something that then needs to be addressed rather than avoided, which is what Jennifer was talking about earlier.
Well, I just think that's fascinating, Michelle, what you're saying about, is fear keeping me smaller than I should be? And oftentimes I think there's so much truth in that. I think for women, there's a lot of truth in that, because there's a fear that if I am my full potential and if I'm as big as I can be, is there going to be someone out there who can handle that? And so sometimes we keep ourselves smaller because we fear what would happen, if I were successful, or what would my boss think of me, and we have this idea that you can't outshine anyone around you.
Michelle, do you have any fears you could share with us?
Well, I was terrified when I went through my divorce. I don't know if terrified is the right word, but there was a lot of uncertainty how things were going to sort out. And even though I had spent 3 years in therapy and thinking about it and how was it going to work, and really coming to a discerned, clear decision that it was the best thing, and the option that would lead to the growth for everyone involved or everyone who chose that, it was still scary. How long is this going to last? Who are the people in my life who are going to not come back, and what am I going to do without them? How's this going to look for my children? That was really, really hard. But that same girl who at the time then was 8 years old instead of 6 years old came to me one day when I was thinking about it. I hadn't told my children yet. And she said, "You know what, Mom? I just want to tell you something. If you're brave, you'll have a lot more fun. And if you're scared, you'll never get what you want." Just randomly, this child came up to me. So obviously, I think that children pick up on what their mothers are dealing with, even if you're not saying it out loud. And some kids more than others. But I had a moment then when I was like, gosh, what kind of role model am I going to be if I live in my fear?
And that's true for so many women. In fact, interesting that all three of us have been divorced. So we've all faced the fear of divorce and gotten through the monster. But what is your advice, Jennifer, for a lot of women? In fact, you're writing a whole book on it, for women that are afraid as they face their divorce.
Yeah. Well, that book's going to be on hold for now, but I have plenty of content.
Yes.
And I think we'll have to do some episodes on divorce because for me, it just wasn't fear. It was just terror. And it was beyond something that was, there are people who just get divorced, and I have some patients who just, we're not going to be together, and we get divorced. And when you really open that box and look at it, for me, it hit a childhood trigger, and I was sent into a panic for a couple of years. I was just like treading water. So, but I think the important thing is to first know what you're afraid of, to name it. Because oftentimes we have this feeling of fear that's so vague, but we don't know what it represents. I'm thinking of a patient who came into my office around tax time. He said, "I'm terrified to file my taxes." And he kept filing for an extension, and one right after the other. And I said, "Well, are your finances a mess? Like, why?" I'm just trying to figure out like why. And he said, "No." He said, I said, "Are they complicated?" He said, "Well, I just have a W-2 and a couple forms." I said, "Do you have them?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you do your own taxes?" He said, "No, I have a CPA." And I said, "Okay, so you just have to hand the papers to the CPA and then you're done." And he said, "Yeah." So I said, "Okay, so you're not afraid to do your taxes because you're not afraid to hand someone papers." He's like, "You're right." And it dawned on him, like, what am I afraid of? And we had to like dig a little deeper. And he had an uncle who had been, and when this patient was very young, so he doesn't know the details, he just knew he had an uncle who had a big business and at some point lost it all. And so the family was just financially devastated. So he had kind of internalized this. And so he had this fear that as soon as he filed his taxes, somehow everything he owned would just be taken from him. And so that was what had kept him from filing these taxes, even though we went through question by question, do you usually have to pay a lot of money? No, I usually get a return. So you have to know what you're afraid of. He had this vague fear that was just haunting him for months and months and months that had nothing to do with the thing he was avoiding. So you have to know what it is. And then I tell people, you have to address your catastrophic thinking. Because we take these little thoughts, and the more creative you are, the worse it is, right? And I'm pretty creative, so I'm very good at catastrophic thinking. This will happen, then this, and this, and this, and this, and we build it up to this huge thing, like him losing his house or losing everything when, even if he wasn't getting a refund, what was he going to owe? Like, a couple $100. This is not the equivalence of losing your house. So you have to look at what you're contributing in terms of your own catastrophic thinking, and you have to own that. And you have to compare what it actually is to this worst case scenario to kind of give yourself that perspective of what you're doing to yourself. And so then you have to separate them. And this situation here is not this catastrophic event, so therefore I can do this situation. And so there's simple steps like that to working towards your fear, but you first have to name it and know what it is.
I want to speak on this creativity thing, because it's something that I see all the time. I have a tendency to attract artists and creatives into my practice, and I see a direct correlation with creativity and imagination and anxiety, because it's exactly as you said. And it's using that energy in your brain to create the worst case scenario. And at some point, evolutionarily, this probably was helpful for survival, but it's not doing anything for you right now. And what if you took that same amount of energy and paired it with direction and goal setting and envisioning a future that you wanted? Because for me, with the divorce, it was a decision between the fear of alienating people that I loved and really causing pain, which is not at all what I'm about, and the fear of not living the life that I'm intended to live. And eventually it got to a point where one outweighed the other.
And it's so true, though. Another thing, a common saying is that 90% of the things we worry about never actually happen. So we spend so much time worrying. What's some good tips, and because we're coming to the end of the show, what are some good tips to give people? One, I like to tell people 90% of the things we worry about don't happen, so why waste the energy worrying? I think it is an evolutionary thing, this fear and anxiety. Breathing is always something good, to take a breath and take another breath and calm down. What are some other tips you want to offer the audience on dealing with that anxiety?
So there's two things I really think of. One is practicing mindfulness of being in the moment. So once you name your fear and you know what it actually is, you can start planning for it. But the question is, in this moment right now, do you need to be living in it? So, I've had cancer surgery in the past, and I'll talk about it on one of these podcasts. I didn't have cancer, but I had to have kind of a preventative surgery. It was a major deal. And so it was super stressful. And, I could spend all my time just thinking about the what ifs and what's going to happen after I have this surgery. My whole life is going to change. And I would have to stop myself and just say, in this moment right now, do I need to be thinking about that? And being mindful and being in the moment, and taking time to do that throughout the day. All I need to be doing right now is chopping these veggies and making this soup. That's all I need to do. Or all I need to do for the next 2 hours is read this book, or all I need to do is dive into this project. I don't need to think about this. And creating pockets for yourself of being in the current moment and not always being under the umbrella of a fear, especially if it's realistic and it's going to be chronic. The second thing I pull out of my pocket all the time is belly breathing. And it's one of the best ways you can relax. You can do it anywhere. It really just involves, when we are in fight or flight, we breathe and we're in our chests, and it's part of what gets the oxygen into our bloodstream and helps us, get ready for that fight or flight. But it's not a relaxing breathing. And relaxing breathing comes from when we really expand the diaphragm and let all the air kind of pull into the very bottoms of our lungs. And to do that, our bellies have to expand. And so practicing the art of belly breathing, you can lay down flat. You can picture like you have a string coming out of your belly button. And every time you breathe in, your belly rises and your chest doesn't move. I'll sometimes in my office have a patient put one hand on their chest and one hand on the belly and have them practice breathing. And the hand that's on the chest should be still, and the one that's on the belly should be moving in and out. You picture like a balloon in your abdomen. It's expanding out and expanding down and expanding out. And when you really focus on that breathing, you cause a physiologic shift away from fight or flight and panic into a more relaxed mode. So those are the two things that I think are the best way to fight a chronic fear.
I love that advice. In fact, once a doctor had told me about that, and I actually even try to practice it sometimes in the bathtub. And it's really, to me, was interesting to think how much we take our breathing for granted and how little time we spend to just breathe. Your tips, Michelle, because we're running out of time here.
Well, I'm going to actually build on what Jennifer said, because breathing is so important. There's a saying that anxiety is excitement without the breath, right? Or fear is excitement without the breath. That same feeling of having your heart racing or having strong muscles, all of that physiological response can be perceived as either good or bad. And so I think that one of the things that people get stuck in is they try to practice this belly breathing for the first time in the middle of a panic attack. And I always recommend to people that it's not your tool yet until you've practiced it in some calm places. And it's like anything, the more you practice it, the better you'll get at it. But the first place to practice it is when you're actually in a really good place, and just play with it and see how it feels and see how calm you can get. So maybe you start when you're a 3 out of 10 anxious and try and bring a 3 to a 2, versus when you're a 10 out of 10 anxious. That's not the first time you want to start belly breathing. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can do it in bed, at night when you're trying to fall asleep. I do it in my office throughout the day. When you're driving in the car, I'm always kind of resetting myself and belly breathing, because when we have the stresses of the day, we hold tension in our bodies, and it's really a way to kind of just be in that moment and release that tension. And it sets off a cascade of relaxation throughout the body.
Yeah, that's one time that I tend to regularly do it. I find at night it's very useful. To just kind of breathe to get myself to fall asleep when I feel that I'm having a hard time falling asleep. I find that the breathing really helps. A couple of minutes left. Any last thoughts?
Yeah. So one other thing that I want to bring up is on the topic of mindfulness, but in general, as you know, I'm a mother of 4, and I'm both an adult psychiatrist and a child psychiatrist, and particularly a family of psychiatrists. So I consider myself something of a aficionado of children's literature. And I think that children's authors and the illustrators have this big job, because they're going to do what we tried to do in 300 pages in like 24. And a book that I love about mindfulness, which is out, it's new, it's called I Am Peace, and it's by Susan Verde with art by Peter Reynolds, whose books I just adore. And it's a way to, even if you're an adult, you can go out and get this children's book, and the pictures will probably resonate with you. And I promise you can finish it tonight.
Well, that sounds like a great suggestion. I have a good quote. There was one, I'll have to figure out the name of the movie, but it's a movie where it talks about being still. And I think that's sometimes so important, that thought of being still. Jennifer, any last thoughts? We have just a couple of minutes, or we can just sign off. I just wanted to make sure we got all our topics covered for this session.
Yeah, I think that I would look forward to doing a whole series on discussing kind of our anxieties and our fears, and hearing a lot from our listeners on the types of things that they want to hear about on this topic, because it's so very broad.
And I think a good place maybe even to start and take advantage of the expertise that we have here with child psychiatry is to start right when some of this anxiety does start. And a lot of children are facing anxiety. And I think a lot of moms would appreciate the information on how to help their kids deal with anxiety, because I think if you start then it's kind of a great tool to last a lifetime. So I'm going to thank all our audience for joining us on Love and Flowers and You. Please send us your questions so we can have our experts answer them.
Email us at loveandflowersandYou@gmail.com. So it is all spelled out. Love, Love, and AND, flowers, and you @gmail.com. loveandflowersandYou@gmail.com. That's the email. And please don't forget to subscribe and download the podcast so you don't miss out on any of this life-transforming information. Tune in to our next episode as Michelle and Jennifer continue guiding you to discover your own light and give you the tools on your path to a more fulfilling life.